You see a lot of things when you sit on the bench for decades. You see honest mistakes. You see calculated greed. And occasionally, you see a performance so theatrical, so entirely disconnected from reality, that it belongs on a Broadway stage rather than in a court of law. This is the story of Sarah Jenkins, a woman who genuinely believed that if she cried hard enough, the facts would simply wash away. The dispute involved $8,500. The plaintiff was an elderly gentleman named Arthur Pendelton, 72 years old, retired postal worker, a man who stood quietly at his table, holding a neatly organized folder of bank statements. His hands shook slightly, not from anger, but from the exhausting weight of feeling foolish. Across from him stood the defendant, Sarah Jenkins, 28 years old, local contractor, dressed in an oversized, faded cardigan that looked intentionally chosen to project vulnerability. Years of courtroom experience teach you to read a room before anyone even opens their mouth. Body language often screams the truth, while words are still figuring out how to lie. Arthur looked defeated. Sarah looked like she was preparing for an audition. From the exact second I called the case, the performance began. Before Arthur could even state his name for the record, Sarah brought a crumpled tissue to her face. Not a single word of testimony had been spoken yet, but the tears were already flowing. That caught my attention immediately. Genuine tears usually arrive when a painful truth is spoken or a difficult memory is recalled. Fake tears? Fake tears usually arrive before anyone has a chance to speak at all. They are not an emotional reaction, they are a strategic shield. A way to signal to the room, "Look how fragile I am. You cannot possibly hold me accountable." I raised my hand, stopping the proceedings. "Miss Jenkins, put the tissue down. We haven't even started." She sniffled loudly, hunching her shoulders to look smaller. "I'm just so overwhelmed, Your Honor. He's been harassing me." Interesting. Very interesting. Her first words were not a defense of the missing money. Her first words were an attack on the victim. This is a classic deflection tactic. When someone cannot defend the evidence against them, they immediately attack the character of the person holding that evidence. It is a desperate attempt to shift the focus. I turned my attention to Arthur. "Mr. Pendleton, please explain why we are here." Arthur cleared his throat. He systematically explained how Sarah had knocked on his door 3 months ago, claiming his roof was on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. She showed him terrifying pictures of rotted wood on her phone. She told him it was an emergency. She took his $8,500 check, cashed it that exact same afternoon, and never returned to do a single minute of work. And every 15 seconds during Arthur's explanation, Sarah would let out a loud, shuddering sob. Not a subtle cry. A disruptive, attention-seeking wail, perfectly timed to interrupt Arthur's strongest points. "She's trying to distract you," Arthur said softly, his voice trembling. "I am fully aware of exactly what she is doing, sir," I replied. I looked directly at Sarah. She was shaking her shoulders and wiping her face, but I noticed something critical. Her eyes were remarkably dry. There it was, the first major red flag. Sarah was spending all her energy trying to control the emotional narrative of my courtroom. But what she didn't realize was that her theatrical sobbing was about to run headfirst into a piece of objective reality, a piece of evidence that doesn't care about tears, doesn't feel pity, and doesn't blink. "Miss Jenkins," I said, my voice cutting through her manufactured sobs, "you took $8,500 from this man for a roof repair. Where is the roof? Where are the materials? Where is the money?" Sarah sniffled, dabbing her dry eyes with the crumpled tissue. "It's complicated, Your Honor. The supply chain is an absolute mess right now. I tried to order the specific shingles he wanted, but they were back-ordered. And then he started harassing me, calling me every single day. I felt incredibly threatened." There it was again, the strategic pivot. Years on the bench teach you to listen very carefully to what people don't say. She didn't say she actually bought the materials. She didn't produce a single receipt. She only offered a convenient excuse wrapped in a heavy accusation. Arthur leaned forward, his hands resting on his neatly organized folder. "I called her twice a week for a month," he explained quietly. "My roof was leaking directly into my living room. I just wanted to know when she was coming back to start the work." "He was aggressive," Sarah interrupted, her voice suddenly losing its fragile tremor and becoming remarkably sharp. "I am a young woman, trying to run an independent business. People like him always try to intimidate me." The courtroom went completely silent. Several spectators exchanged glances. That was a fascinating shift. 1 second, she was a terrified victim crying into a tissue, and the exact next second, she was a fierce, defensive entrepreneur, weaponizing her youth to avoid answering a simple financial question. I watched her carefully. Her shoulders were no longer hunched. Her chin was slightly raised. The tears had magically vanished the moment she found an angle she thought would win the room. "Miss Jenkins," I said calmly, leaning forward, "being a young woman in business does not exempt you from doing the work you were contracted and paid to do. Have you refunded his money?" "I can't," she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "I already spent it on overhead. Business expenses. It's not my fault the materials were delayed." "Overhead?" I asked. "You cashed his check on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday he had a leak, and you were nowhere to be found. What specific overhead did you pay for with his $8,500? Sarah hesitated. She realized she had stepped into a trap of her own making. She quickly uncrossed her arms, grabbed her tissue, and immediately started sobbing loudly again. "You're attacking me just like he did. This is entirely unfair. Nobody understands how hard it is for me. It is a very dangerous game to play the victim in a courtroom when you are the one holding the actual victim's money. It is an even more dangerous game when you assume the judge isn't paying attention to the timeline." Arthur slowly opened his folder. "Your Honor, I have the bank records showing exactly when and where she cashed the check. And I have something else." Sarah's dramatic sobbing paused, just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. The tissue lowered slightly from her face. Her eyes darted toward Arthur's hands. "What else do you have, Mr. Pendleton?" I asked. "My neighbor," Arthur said, pulling out a small flash drive. "My neighbor has a high-definition security camera pointing directly at my driveway, and it recorded exactly what Miss Jenkins was doing the week she claimed she was ordering my materials." "A flash drive," Sarah repeated. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. It was tight, defensive, and suddenly very, very small. Arthur handed the drive to my bailiff Bird, who plugged it into the courtroom monitor. "Let's see exactly what the supply chain issues look like, Miss Jenkins," I said, leaning back in my chair. The monitor flickered to life. The footage was crystal clear, time-stamped 2:15 p.m. on a Wednesday, exactly one day after Sarah had cashed Arthur's $8,500 check for emergency roofing materials. The video showed Arthur's driveway. Sarah's white pickup truck pulled in, but it wasn't loaded with shingles, tar paper, or ladders. It was completely empty. Sarah stepped out of the truck, but she wasn't wearing work boots or a tool belt. She was wearing a bright summer dress, holding a clipboard, and looking around the property. She walked up to Arthur's front door, knocked, and waited. When no one answered, she turned around, and then the camera captured something fascinating. She didn't look at the roof, not once. She didn't pull out a ladder to inspect the supposed catastrophic damage. She didn't take any measurements. Instead, she walked over to the side of the house, peered through a window, checked her phone, and then walked back to her truck. Before getting in, she took a selfie with the house in the background, laughed at something on her screen, and drove away. The entire visit lasted exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds. The courtroom was dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the monitor. I looked at Sarah. The crumpled tissue was resting on the table. The tears were completely gone. Her face was flushed, her jaw set tight. She looked exactly like someone who had just realized the script they memorized was for the wrong play. "So," I began, my voice deliberately slow, "let me make sure I understand the timeline, Miss Jenkins. On Tuesday, you take $8,500 for an absolute emergency. On Wednesday afternoon, you show up at his house for less than 4 minutes, take a selfie, and never look at the roof. Tell me, were the back-ordered materials hiding in your phone?" "I was doing a site assessment," she blurted out, her voice loud and sharp. "I needed to make sure the property was secure before the delivery arrived." "A site assessment," I repeated, without looking at the site. "You don't understand how contracting works," she yelled, pointing a finger at me. "I was checking the access points for the delivery truck. That's standard procedure. You're just trying to make me look bad because he's an old man and I'm a young woman." There it was, the final, desperate pivot. When fake tears fail, and when the evidence destroys the excuse, the scammer almost always resorts to screaming about discrimination. They try to make the courtroom the villain so they don't have to be. But I am not intimidated by volume, and I certainly don't care about a scammer's outrage. "Miss Jenkins," I said, leaning forward, my voice cutting through her shouting, "I understand exactly how contracting works. You take a deposit, you buy materials, and you do the work. What you did was take a deposit, buy nothing, do nothing, and then come into my courtroom and try to cry your way out of a felony." "It's not a felony," she screamed. It's a business dispute. No, I replied softly. A business dispute is when you paint a house the wrong color. Taking $8,500 from a senior citizen and never returning is grand theft. Arthur sat quietly. He didn't need to say another word. The video had spoken for him. Sarah had spoken for herself. The truth was standing naked in the middle of the room, and Sarah Jenkins was completely out of ways to dress it up. Grand theft. The words hung heavy in the air. Sarah's face cycled through several emotions in the span of 3 seconds: shock, indignation, and finally genuine, undeniable fear. For the first time that morning, the theatrical tears were replaced by the cold, hard sweat of consequence. She slammed both hands onto the defendant's table. You can't say that. I am a professional. I have a registered LLC. Having 3 letters at the end of your company name does not give you a license to steal from the elderly, I replied, keeping my voice dangerously low. Now, you claimed you spent his $8,500 on overhead. You said you spent it on business expenses. I want to see your business ledger for the week you cashed his check. Sarah froze. Her posture stiffened. Whenever a scammer is asked for objective documentation, they suddenly develop a severe case of organizational amnesia. I don't have it with me, she stammered, looking everywhere except at me. My accountant is auditing my files this week. Everything is tied up. How incredibly convenient, I said. Fortunately, Mr. Pendelton is a very thorough man. Arthur adjusted his glasses and looked down at his neatly stacked folder. Your Honor, when I initially filed a police report for fraud, before they told me it had to go through civil court, the investigating officer gave me a piece of advice. He told me to look at her public social media accounts for the dates right after she cashed my check. Interesting. Very interesting. Arthur might have been 72 years old, but he understood the modern world perfectly well. People who steal money rarely have the discipline to hide it. Their arrogance practically forces them to show it off. Arthur handed a stack of high-quality color prints to the bailiff. These are printed screenshots from Miss Jenkins' public Instagram page, dated Thursday through Sunday of that exact same week. Sarah actually gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of air. She reached her hand out instinctively, as if she could snatch the papers from across the room. That's a violation of my privacy. You can't use those. Those are personal. If you post it on the internet for the entire world to see, Miss Jenkins, it ceases to be private, I said, taking the papers from Bird. I looked at the first photograph. It was a picture of Sarah, wearing the exact same bright summer dress from the security footage. She was posing outside a high-end luxury boutique, holding a brand-new designer handbag. But it was the caption that made the entire courtroom freeze. I looked directly at Sarah, holding up the photo. The caption here reads, Retail therapy, treating myself to some new overhead, accompanied by a winking emoji. Sarah swallowed hard. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. A $3,000 handbag, Miss Jenkins? I asked. Is this the roofing material you were waiting on? Did you plan to nail this designer leather to his roof to stop the rain? I use that bag for client meetings, she blurted out, her voice cracking with desperation. It's a legitimate business expense. You have to project success to attract wealthy clients. You project success with money you stole from a retired postal worker living on a fixed pension, I asked. The spectators were completely silent. You could feel the absolute, heavy disgust radiating through the courtroom. Sarah was no longer just a bad contractor. She was a predator. Then, I flipped to the second page. A photo of Sarah and 3 friends holding cocktails at an upscale beachfront resort in Miami. The timestamp was Friday evening, just 3 days after she took Arthur's money for an emergency. The caption below the photo was so brazen, so completely devoid of a moral compass, that even I had to read it twice to believe it. I lowered the paper and looked at her, and she knew exactly what I was about to read aloud. The caption on your Miami Beach photo, Miss Jenkins, I read slowly, making sure my voice carried to the very back row of the courtroom. Financing my weekend getaway courtesy of a gullible boomer. Stay toxic, ladies. Accompanied by a champagne glass emoji. The courtroom collectively gasped. I am not exaggerating. A low, audible murmur of absolute disbelief rippled through the spectators. I looked over at Arthur Pendelton. He didn't look angry. He looked heartbroken. The kind of quiet, dignified heartbreak that comes from realizing someone looked at your kindness and saw only a target. He had trusted this young woman to fix the roof over his head, and she had used his life savings to buy overpriced drinks in Florida while mocking his age on the internet. Miss Jenkins, I said, dropping the photograph onto my desk. The sound of the paper hitting the wood felt as loud as a gavel strike. Would you like to explain the business strategy behind calling your client a gullible boomer while spending his money in Miami? Sarah's perfect, theatrical facade completely shattered. The confident business owner was gone. The weeping victim was gone. What remained was cornered panic. It was a joke, she stammered, her voice frantic, her hands gripping the edges of her podium so hard her knuckles turned white. You're taking it out of context. It's a social media trend. People post things like that ironically all the time to get engagement. It doesn't mean I wasn't going to do the job. A trend, I repeated, letting the absolute absurdity of her defense hang in the air. Yes, she insisted, leaning forward, desperately hoping volume would somehow validate her lie. It's just an inside joke for my followers. I was still going to fix his roof. I just needed to decompress first. You don't understand how stressful my industry is. Interesting. Very interesting. Notice the psychological shift. When cornered by undeniable, documented proof of her own malice, she didn't apologize. She didn't show an ounce of remorse. She doubled down on entitlement. She genuinely believed that her need to decompress on a Friday was more important than an elderly man's leaking roof. Let me explain something to you about context, I said, locking eyes with her. Context is everything leading up to this exact moment. Context is you taking $8,500 on a Tuesday. Context is you spending Wednesday buying designer bags and taking selfies. Context is you spending Friday drinking in Florida while Arthur was putting buckets in his living room to catch the rain. Sarah opened her mouth to interrupt again, but I raised a single finger. Do not speak, I warned, and for the first time all day, she actually listened. You came into this courtroom wearing an oversized sweater, clutching a tissue, and forcing out tears before a single piece of evidence was presented. You tried to weaponize your youth. You tried to paint Mr. Pendelton as an aggressive bully, hoping I would be too blind to look at the facts. Sarah stared at the floor. The fight was rapidly draining out of her. But facts, I continued, do not care about your tears. Facts do not care about your social media engagement. And facts certainly do not care about your overhead. Then, my bailiff, Bird, approached the bench again. He handed me a yellow slip of paper, an urgent message from the clerk's office outside. I read it once, folded it in half, and looked back down at Sarah Jenkins. Because if she thought the social media posts were the worst part of her day, she had absolutely no idea what was waiting for her next. So, I said, pointing to the photo of Sarah and her friends in Miami. Let's recap. A site assessment on Wednesday, a flight on Thursday, and cocktails on the beach by Friday evening. Did I miss any critical contracting procedures, Miss Jenkins? Sarah was breathing heavily, her face entirely flushed. She was darting her eyes around the courtroom, desperately searching for an exit strategy. Scammers rely on momentum and chaos. When the facts corner them, they almost always try to invent a brand new crisis to deflect from the current one. I used my personal credit card for that trip, she shouted, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. It had absolutely nothing to do with his money. I am allowed to go on vacation. You are completely overstepping your authority by looking at my personal life. Really, I replied. Your personal credit card. That is your final answer? Yes, she insisted, nodding violently. It was entirely separate. I slowly turned the page on the stack of documents Arthur had provided. Mr. Pendelton, what is this final document? Arthur cleared his throat. He looked at Sarah, not with anger, but with a quiet, undeniable clarity. Your Honor, when I realized she wasn't returning to fix my roof, and when she stopped answering my calls, I went to my bank. I explained the situation to the manager. And what did the bank manager tell you? I prompted. He told me that my $8,500 check was cashed on Tuesday, Arthur said. But he also told me something else. He noticed a highly unusual transaction pattern. Sarah went completely rigid. Arthur continued. My bank manager flagged a transaction because on Thursday morning, a completely separate $4,200 charge hit my account. It was a charge I did not make. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, and the color had completely drained from her face. Miss Jenkins, I said softly, it appears you didn't just take his $8,500 check. Did you also memorize his routing and account numbers from the bottom of that check? She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Mr. Pendelton, I said, never taking my eyes off Sarah. Where was that unauthorized $4,200 charge made? It was a charge for an airline ticket, a hotel reservation, and a VIP table service, Arthur said quietly, in Miami, Florida. The courtroom spectators let out a collective gasp. Sarah Jenkins had not just lied about the delay. She had not just lied about the materials. She had not just stolen the deposit. She had actively, intentionally committed bank fraud to fund the exact vacation she was currently trying to defend. It was a mistake, Sarah shrieked, panic entirely overtaking her. My accounting software mixed up the accounts. I was going to pay it back. It was just a temporary hold. A temporary hold, I repeated, my voice dropping to a whisper. You a senior citizen's checking account as your personal ATM to buy VIP table service in Miami, and you expect me to believe it was an accounting error? Sarah was shaking her head frantically. The tears were back, but this time they were real. The theatrical performance was completely dead, replaced by the terrifying realization of actual, severe consequences. I am a business owner, she cried out. I just needed a break. I work so hard. You don't work, I stated flatly. You pray. You don't work, I stated flatly. You pray. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah collapsed back into her chair. The oversized cardigan, the perfectly messy hair, the practiced tears, all of the props she had brought into my courtroom to play the victim were completely useless now. She wasn't an independent business owner navigating a difficult supply chain. She was a petty thief who had just confessed to felony bank fraud on the public record. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. She wasn't performing for the audience this time. Please, Your Honor, don't send this to the prosecutor. I can pay him back. I'll call my parents. They can wire the money right now. I'll get it today. Notice the psychological shift. 30 minutes earlier, she was a fierce, independent entrepreneur who didn't need anyone's help and bitterly resented being questioned. The moment she faced actual, undeniable consequences, the arrogant LLC owner vanished. She immediately reverted to being a child, expecting her parents to simply buy her way out of trouble. But my courtroom is not a place where you can wire away your sins. I picked up the yellow slip of paper that my bailiff, Bird, had handed me just moments before. I held it up between my fingers. I watched Sarah's eyes lock onto the bright yellow square. People who live their lives scamming others always know the exact sound of the other shoe dropping. Do you know what happens, Miss Jenkins, when a senior citizen files a fraud report that gets transferred to a civil docket? I asked. She shook her head slowly, completely unable to speak. The clerk's office runs a routine search on the business entity involved, I explained, keeping my voice dangerously calm, just to see if there is a pattern, just to see if we are dealing with a simple contract dispute or something much worse. I unfolded the paper. It seems Mr. Pendelton is not the only gullible boomer funding your retail therapy, is he? Sarah buried her face in her hands. She didn't even try to deny it. She knew it was over. According to the clerk's office, I read aloud, there have been 3 new civil complaints filed against your LLC in the last 48 hours alone, all from homeowners over the age of 70, all living in the exact same zip code as Mr. Pendleton, all claiming they paid emergency cash deposits for roof repairs, and all claiming the contractor never returned. The spectators murmured again, the sound thick with disgust. Arthur Pendelton sat up a little straighter at his table. He realized in that moment that he wasn't just fighting for his own $8,500 anymore. He had just dragged a serial predator into the light. You didn't just make an accounting mistake, Miss Jenkins, I said, leaning forward so she had no choice but to look at me. You systematically canvassed a retirement neighborhood. You actively targeted people you thought were too old to check their bank statements online, too tired to follow up, and too intimidated to drag you into a courtroom. You thought you could just put on a cardigan, squeeze out a few fake tears, and I would let you go right back to the beach. She was sobbing now, ugly, heavy, hyperventilating sobs. But it was far too late for tears. Sarah Jenkins sat at the defendant's table, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. But I felt absolutely no pity for her. Years on the bench teach you to distinguish between the tears of the innocent and the tears of the caught. She wasn't crying because she felt genuine remorse for stealing from Arthur Pendelton. She was crying because her carefully constructed illusion had just collapsed in a spectacular fashion, and the real world was waiting for her outside those courtroom doors. I turned my attention away from her and looked at Arthur. He stood quietly, his hands resting on the folder that had successfully unraveled a serial scammer. Mr. Pendleton, I said, my voice softening, your meticulous record-keeping, your patience, and your refusal to be intimidated by this woman didn't just recover your own life savings today. It has likely saved dozens of other elderly citizens in your community from becoming her next vacation fund." Arthur simply nodded, a quiet dignity in his posture. "Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $12,700, I announced clearly. That covers the unreturned $8,500 deposit and the $4,200 unauthorized charge she fraudulently made on your account." I picked up my pen, signed the order, and then looked directly at my bailiff. "Bird, I want you to make immediate copies of the security footage, the bank statements, and the social media printouts." Sarah raised her head, her mascara running down her cheeks. "Why?" she whispered, her voice completely broken. "Because, Miss Jenkins, my jurisdiction is civil," I replied coldly, "but your actions are criminal. I am forwarding this entire docket, along with the 3 additional complaints filed against your LLC, directly to the district attorney's office for an immediate investigation into elder financial abuse, grand larceny, and wire fraud." The courtroom was entirely silent. The spectators didn't make a sound. Sarah's mouth opened, but the arrogant, interrupting, self-proclaimed victim had finally run out of words. There were no more excuses about supply chains. There were no more rants about her overhead. There was only the crushing, unavoidable weight of accountability. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, she didn't look back. She left behind the crumpled tissue she had used to fake her tears at the very beginning of the hearing. It sat on the table, dry and useless. I have presided over thousands of cases. I have seen every type of manipulation imaginable. But Sarah Jenkins will always stand out. She walked into my courtroom, genuinely believing that she could control the narrative simply by acting fragile. She believed that a theatrical performance could replace reality, and that her status as an independent business owner made her untouchable. But she learned a painful lesson that applies far beyond the walls of any courtroom. You can fake your emotions. You can delete your arrogant social media posts. You can try to shout over the facts, but sooner or later, the truth gets its turn to speak. And when the truth finally speaks, no amount of fake tears can wash it away.